Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Today we are speaking about American Jewry, which in the minds of many is a great success story. The mind of others is a story of a catastrophe, and it just shows you how much of this story is up for interpretation. American Jewry itself is a very diverse group, and just as diverse as American Jewry is, so too is diverse of the thoughts on what is the story of American Jewry. Is it a success story? Is it not? What is it? So just to give you an idea of how debated the issue of American Jewry is, you can easily see that just in the numbers of how many Jews live in America or how many Jews live in every state are so wildly different. And the reason for that is because it has to do with the question of what do you consider Jewish and how many Jews are where and who identifies as a Jew. And that sort of, even looking at the wild differences between the numbers, gives you an idea of how different the perceptions of Judaism in America are. Who is a Jew, who identifies as a Jew. Some people are Jewish but don't identify as such. Some identify but may not be according to some denominations, etc. We'll talk about that. But before we begin, I want to share with you a story that really gives away the idea of what it means to be an American Jew and what the story of Jews in America is. There's a beautiful story shared by Rabbi Emanuel Feldman. Anyone ever hear of him? He was a rabbi in Atlanta, Georgia. He's still alive, but he was a rabbi there a while ago. And he wrote a great book called Tales Out of the Shul, or Tales Out of the Synagogue. And in this book, he shares his stories as a rabbi in Atlanta, Georgia. So one of the great stories I remember is there was a man who lived 2 hours outside of Atlanta, Georgia. And he would drive in every month or so with chickens in his trunk. And he would come to get a shochet in Atlanta, Georgia, to get kosher meat. So he drove in for 2 hours. He would have the shechita, put the chicken back in his trunk after it was shechted, and drive back to whatever place he lived in 2 hours out of Atlanta. One day, his wife told him, "Look, why are you such a schlepper? You have to go every month. You have to drive 2 hours into Atlanta. Why can't you do it yourself?" And she gives him a kitchen knife, and she tells him, "Go back to the behind the garage, take the chickens, and take this knife that I'm giving you." Of course, she didn't know that there are many, many, many laws that involve shechita, what kind of knife it is, and who the shochet can be, but they didn't know. And she says, "Go behind the garage and do the shechita yourself." So she sends him out, and 10 minutes go by, 20 minutes go by, an hour goes by, she doesn't see her husband. And she finally walks out of the house. She goes back behind the house, and the man who she asked to man up was laying there on the floor, fainted out of fear that he would have to see blood, and the chickens were running around freely. So it's a funny story about how the guy just fainted from fear from having to do the shechita himself, but it also is very much a story of what American Jewry is, and the idea that America is so vast and large that, unlike many other Jewish communities around the world, to say Judaism here or to have some kind of established Judaism here is so difficult because we're spread out across such vast amounts of land, and it's really hard to have Jewish infrastructure. I mean, look at Manhattan. How many kosher restaurants do you have here? How many supermarkets? To have Jewish life, you need to have infrastructure, you need to have a lot of people, and that's very difficult when people are scattered and they're free to do as they wish. It's much, much easier if you're living in a shtetl in Poland, where the local landlord tells you all Jews must live in this little town, and then you have your rabbi, your shochet, your everything. So to me, this story exemplifies what Judaism in America is, because it's just so spread out. People don't even know that they're doing something wrong. And also people don't necessarily have the knowledge to know that they should seek out something else. So just Jews in America is an extraordinary phenomenon. We're also the first Jewish community in history to be allowed to live in freedom. No other Jewish community was allowed to live in freedom before American Jewry. And we were also the first, we're going to see exactly how that happened. We're also the first Jewish community to be told, pursue your religion. Obviously, we've seen what that happened in France and other countries where we sort of were asked to keep it down. In America, Jews were asked to pursue their religion. And that is really an extraordinary experiment. Just like there's the American experiment, there is also the American Jewish experiment. Now, again, some will see it as an extraordinary success story. Others cite it as a story of, even some will call it a tragedy when they speak of the assimilation, etc. We'll see the different approaches. So first of all, there's this whole discussion of whether Christopher Columbus was Jewish or not. And it's important to note, it's not a quirky conversation. It's not like a Snapple fact. It's a really, really important conversation, because even if Christopher Columbus was not Jewish, the fact that his ship arrives here in 1492, the fact that he had definitely, with no question, some Jews on his ship, the fact that some of the funding came from Jews is extremely important, because it's, sorry?
Map.
And it's no coincidence that it's the same year that the Spanish expulsion takes place. It's not a coincidence that it's exactly the same year that Spain decides to expel more than 100,000 Jews. So actually, and we're going to see that the Spanish expulsion loomed over America for hundreds of years. It's not a side detail. It's not just a fun fact. A quarter of the people coming from Spain and Portugal to South America are Jewish. That's not a small fact, and it's definitely not a coincidence. To understand early American history, all the way into the American Jewish history, all the way until the 1800s, you must understand the Spanish Inquisition and the fact that the Spanish Inquisition pursued people all the way to South America, and that is very, very, very important. Basically, what happened was, after 1492, after many Jews immigrated to Portugal, the crown of Portugal decided it wanted to marry into the crown of marry the daughter, I believe, of Queen Isabella. And the condition for the marriage was, one of the conditions was, you must expel, you must convert your Jews to Christianity. Now, Portugal, which had a lot of Jews who left Spain, didn't want to lose its Jews. The Jews were great. They were all literate. They all were good with numbers. And so they didn't want to expel their Jews. So the law that they made was different than the Spanish expulsion. The law that Portugal made was, you had no choice. You had to stay. You had to convert to Christianity. There was no out. And so if you're a Jew who left Spain because you wanted to be Jewish and you went to Portugal, you didn't have the option to be Jewish now. And so your only hope to get out of this crazy situation, what's your only hope? Well, there are these new colonies in the New World, and you can go to these new colonies. So you move there. And then what happens? The Spanish Inquisition is so ruthless and so cruel that it goes to South America to check on you, to make sure that you're not being a converso Jew and that you're still living as a good Catholic. And so if there are areas like Recife, Brazil, which are taken over by Holland, then you'll move to that area so you can practice your religion freely. And when the Spanish take over Recife again, that ship of Jews that escapes lands in New York and is the first Jewish community congregation, Shereth Israel, in New York City, the first Jews to be here. I'll speak a bit more about that. But it's just important to understand that the Spanish Inquisition and the expulsion are important to American history hundreds of years into American history. When there's a war between Florida and South Carolina and North Carolina, it makes a big difference, because Florida is Spanish. And if you're a Jew who's been escaping for the past 200, 300 years from the Spanish Inquisition, then you're going to side against the Spanish. The war against Mexico and New Mexico. You don't want to be on the side of the Spanish because you've been running away from them for 300 years. And so the story of America is very much, the story of Jews in America is very much related and a second chapter to the Spanish expulsion, because the Jews that are leaving Spain and Portugal and coming to the new colonies are doing it as a way to get away from a religious persecution, and they do not want to be on the side or territory of Spain as much as they can. So that's just a very, very important detail. And just as Jews who are always looking to go places where we can live safely, they're constantly wandering in the New World to find some safety. Just another important fact is when you study American history, who do you focus on in the beginning? What's considered the sort of the bedrock of America? Massachusetts, the Puritans, Boston, New England. So just to explain why that was not the New Haven that we're talking about, that wasn't the place for Jews to be safe. In 1649, there's a Jew named Solomon Franco, and he's the first Jew to go to Boston. Now, the Puritans are very nice people. They're lovely in comparison to the Spanish, and they give him money and they say, please kindly get out of here. So so the one Jew that lives in Boston, they send away. He goes back to Holland. They don't kill him. They don't forcibly convert him. They don't burn him the way the Spanish did in the auto de fe, but they say, here's a bundle of money, please leave. So the idea that there was this new tolerant place in New England may have been true if you were Protestant, but by no means was there some open arm person waiting for the Jews in these new colonies. They were Puritans, right? They were burning women who they thought were witches. They were doing all kinds of extremist things. So they wouldn't take in that was not where Jewish life in America began. It may have started a lot of ideas about Reformation, etc., but it's not where Jewish life in America began. There's a lot to cover, so I'm going to go a bit fast when speaking about the earlier years. But in 1740, good news from the British government. They passed what's called the British Naturalization Act, which means if you're Jewish, you are free to become a citizen as long as you don't live in England. So what does it mean? It means that you're welcome to go live with the Yankees. If you're Jewish, you can become, but that's great news, because if you're Jewish and you haven't been able to become a citizen for a few hundred years anywhere, then fine, you can go to the new colonies, the new world, and indeed Jews start building up. By the way, we're talking about a very small amount of Jews at this time. We're talking about fewer than 5,000 Jews are living in the New World. Very, very few Jews. All the way till 1776, very few Jews. They're mostly Spanish and Portuguese Jews. They live actually many live in the South, Georgia, South Carolina. Then you have the Shearith Israel congregation in New York. You have some in Newport, Rhode Island. And it's a small community, but it's an important community and important to know about because they really lay the foundation to what we have today. You'll see that many aspects of Jewish life in America today do come from Spanish and Portuguese Jews. So it is important to note what they did. I'm very honored, by the way, to be giving this talk in Manhattan, because this is where they first landed. The Jews from Recife, Brazil, who fled the Spanish Inquisition to the Dutch-controlled area of Recife, Brazil, get on a ship once the Spanish are conquering, and they come to New York. The Dutch governor, famously Stuyvesant, he wants to kick them out, but bad news, the shareholders of the India-Dutch company, many of them are Jewish, and they say, sorry, you're not kicking our people out. They stay and they establish congregation Shearith Israel. We're talking about just a very, very small community, and they become part of American society. And that brings me to the 1700s, the establishment of the United States of America. So you have this whole debate raging between the royalists and those who want the independent United States. It's important to note most Americans, most people living here were not for fighting for independence. Most were okay, like Canadians. They were okay, to full disclosure, I'm also Canadian. So they were okay with being royalists. It was fine. But some of them were really, really helpful to George Washington, most famously someone named Chaim Solomon, who helped George Washington when Washington came to the shocking realization that that he had no money, because it was a fundamental problem in the sense that they had no means of collecting taxes. It was like, I don't know how things exactly work with the EU, but basically there was a US government, but they had no right to tax anybody. So he realized that he had no money, and in the middle of the war, he sends a letter to Chaim Solomon, Chaim help, and Chaim Solomon helps him, and he helps also with the relations with France and other European countries. So he really is very, very helpful. In 1787, another Spanish and Portuguese Jew, and that's why, again, it's important to understand Spanish Portuguese Jews to know what we have today. A very well-known Spanish and Portuguese Jew named Jonas Phillips in Philadelphia looks and reads through the different constitutions of the state, and it says that if you want to take office, you need to take an oath on the New Testament. You need to affirm your Christian faith. And he says, life is good in America, and it's great to be a citizen, but wouldn't it be nice if we had the rights of the same rights of Christians to be in public office? And I'll just read to you the letter he writes to George Washington that sort of paved the way for Jews to be able to serve in public office. He writes to George Washington, it is well known among all the citizens of the 13 United States that the Jews have been true and faithful Whigs, and during the late contest with England, they have been foremost in aiding and assisting the states with their lives, fortunes. They have supported the cause, have bravely fought and bled for liberty, which they cannot enjoy. And so basically, he's asking George Washington to amend the different constitutions to make sure that Jews can hold public office. He says, therefore, if the honorable convention shall in their wisdom think fit and alter the said oath and leave out the words, and he goes on to say, basically remove the oath that says, I believe in the New Testament. And indeed, George Washington listens to what he says. So here's an example of how a small community, less than 5,000 people, really changed the way America works. By the way, not every state accepted that. And there have been several states that it took more than 100 years for them to change the law that to take office, you can also swear not on the New Testament. Interesting fact, there are several states to this day that by law, if you are an atheist, you cannot hold public office. There are states that, according to their laws, that's a thing. In 1790, once things start calming down, there's a very famous visit and letter. George Washington, the president, goes to visit Rhode Island, and he wants to see what needs there are. He meets with community leaders, and Jews write to him a letter. They say, look, we've been around the block. And again, you have to have in mind the whole Spanish-Portuguese history in mind for this. And they say, we want to know, is this a place that will work for us long-term? They're not asking like Jonas Phillips if they can serve as a mayor or a governor. They're really asking if they're about to be sent out the way they were sent out from Spain. And George Washington writes a letter, by the way, a very famous letter. And it's important to note, if you see the sort of religious quotes, you can see he's responding to what they wrote in their letter. It mirrors what they wrote in their letter, which is very biblical, very Jewish. So this is what George Washington writes. In 1790, may the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid, which is a quote from a famous verse in Isaiah, Ish tachat gafno, ish tachat tenato, or Malachim, and he continues and says, may the Father of all mercies scatter light and not darkness in our paths, and make us all in our several vocations useful here, and in his own due time and way everlastingly happy. So basically, he says to them, not only are you going to be allowed to live here, but you'll be able to prosper. You'll be able to plant your fig tree, your vine. You'll sit in peace, and it's a extraordinary historical event that there's a country that's willing to give Jews full rights and peace. However, at the same time, by 1800, I have the exact number for you. By 1800, there are 2,500 Jews in America. Why? Why so few Jews? Look, we've been suffering so much in Europe. Why so few Jews living in America in 1800s? The answer is it's not a simple thing to move across the sea. Again, even though George Washington was not necessarily, it didn't have anything against Jews. He was a very good person. It doesn't mean that everyone in the country shared his views. So that could be another reason. In 1840, something very important happens in the Middle East that is important to American Jewry, and that is the Damascus blood libel. I'm not going to speak about it much, but in Damascus, there's a terrible blood libel, and actually incited by the French Catholic consul general, and he incites this blood libel, and the government goes from house to house and tortures people in ways that I cannot describe here. And to admit that they engage in ritual killing, it causes an international uproar. Shout out to the women in Damascus. They write a letter to the wife of Moses Montefiore, and they say, help, we're in a very bad situation. And that's when, for the first time in the history of American Jews come together to help a cause that's outside of America. So American Jews in 1840 start organizing efforts to respond to the Damascus blood libel and the persecution of Jews in Syria. With all the goodwill, in 1859, American Jews try and establish the Board of Delegates of American Israelites and build some unified umbrella organization. Some of you may laugh because, of course, that can never happen in America. It can happen in the UK. It can happen in South Africa. It cannot happen in America. And this is very much a description of what's going to happen with American Jewry. There cannot be a unified front. In fact, one of the reasons, someone once told me they were working with different organizations in Washington, one of the reasons that the White House has a Jewish liaison who's Jewish and knows what's going on is because they get letters from so many different Jewish organizations, you can't figure out who is Yankee writing from his basement and whose organization representing a million Jews. It's very hard. You need to know what's going on. Another thing that does happen, another reason this happens in 1859 is another story that deserves many hours, and there's a Spielberg movie, I think, coming about it, about the kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara by the Vatican in Italy, something that also causes an earthquake in the Jewish world. And so to respond to threats of forced conversion, they also want to have a unified front. Again, this is 1859. So this tells you how the story of forced conversions and sort of the Catholic Inquisition and the possibility that someone's going to come and force you to convert to Christianity is a very strong element in American Jewry all the way through the 1800s, starting at 1492 with Columbus arriving, and many hundreds of years later. So it's just important to note that. So there's very few Jews living in America at this point. 1840 to 1880, 300,000 Jews come from Germany and the area to America. That's an insane explosion. But if you thought that's crazy, that the German Jews would come here by their 300,000s, just wait for 1880 to 1914, where you have more than 2 million Jews fleeing Russia, and they come. So you have the uniqueness of American Jewry is that it's an explosion. It's almost from zero to everything. Yeah, you have a few thousand Jews, about maybe even not 10,000, and within 100 years you have millions of Jews living here. So that's something that's important to note. And it also helps you understand the lack of infrastructure. Sometimes people criticize American Jewry as lacking day schools and organizations. The population came so fast that it's really impossible to think that in such a short amount of time, we would have had sufficient shechita, sufficient day schools, yeshivas, etc. It's also important to note that the rabbis back in Europe told their students, don't go to America. If you're a good Jew, if you're an Orthodox Jew, do not go to America. Why? They called it the Treifa Medina, the unkosher land. Why is it the unkosher land? Because when you're living in your nice shtetl and you know all your friends, of course you're going to eat kosher food, and you would never even dream in 1,000 years of marrying a Polish non-Jew, nor would she ever dream of marrying a Jew, and so we have no problem. But once Jews moved to America, they were free to do as they wished, which didn't yield very good results from a religious perspective. So it's important to note that it was sort of a self-perpetuating vicious cycle, because on the one hand, America was the treif country where a rabbi should not set foot. On the other hand, why is it such a country? Because there were no rabbinic leaders coming here. In fact, for the first few hundred years of Jews in America, there was not a single rabbi in America. The Spanish and Portuguese community had a cantor. The cantor was a shochet, a mohel, and he knew the tefillah, but they didn't have a rabbi. And so there's no rabbi until the mid-1800s, and the rabbis don't want you to go there. And that creates a major problem. As Jews start coming in more and more, the community builds itself. During the Civil War, American Jews see the only, thank God, the only, and it would be better if this didn't happen either, edict of expulsion, where you wouldn't think, but Ulysses Grant, who is a commander, the general of the North, he orders an edict of expulsion of the Jews of Kentucky. And Abraham Lincoln, and he later became president, Abraham Lincoln hears about this and right away tells him, not in this universe, and he rescinds it. And when he's president, he actually does a few things to sort of amend his relationships with the Jewish community. But that's the only time in American history that you had an official government-issued anti-Semitic edict. Now, here's a very fun and fascinating story. Well, I shouldn't say fun. I don't want to offend anyone. But as the German Jews come, Reform Judaism establishes itself in America. Now, some of these Reform Jews are militant assimilationists, meaning they see assimilation into American society, which is the first to offer us full rights, as an ideal. And so they establish, their stronghold is in Cincinnati, Ohio, and they established the Hebrew Union College for rabbis. The first graduating class has a banquet. It's going to sound funny to some people. It sounded funny to me. The first graduating class has its rabbinic ordination ceremony, and in this ceremony, they serve shrimps, clam. Here, I'll give you the menu: clams, crabs, shrimp, frog's legs, and meat and dairy dishes. The dessert was dairy ice cream. But just as a rabbi here, I must note the prohibition of meat and milk only applies to kosher meat. So if someone's eating pork and milk, it's anyways not a problem. But it still wasn't great that they did the meat and milk. But I honestly doesn't make much of a difference if you're eating shrimps, if you're having milk or not. Yeah. So following this is very important news. Following this, there's a woman who was there who's outraged. Her name is Henrietta Sold. She becomes a huge figure in the Zionist movement, and she writes a letter, and she says, I was outraged that the number of rabbis who protested was surprisingly small. 2 rabbis left the table without having touched the dishes, and I'm happy to state that I know of at least 3 more who ate nothing and were indignant, but signified their disapproval in a less demonstrated manner. So basically, they have this graduating rabbinic class called the treif banquet. It causes an uproar among American Jewry because, you have Jews who are sort of hillbillies or cowboys, but the American Jews are not against keeping kosher. It's probably not possible to keep kosher in the Wild West, but no one wants frog's legs served specifically to make a point. And so in 1885, in response to this, you have what's called the Pittsburgh Platform, where Reform rabbis gather in Pittsburgh and they set out their agenda. And it's very interesting to note this agenda was never officially adopted, but it's really important to know this agenda. Even I say this as an Orthodox rabbi. Why? Because it tells you the story of what became the mainstream in much of American Jewry. A lot of the principles of American Jewry, not principle, a lot of the common practices of American Jewry ended up coming from this. A lot got rejected. This is more of a militant reform version, and it starts with them. I'm going to read some of them, recognizing every other religion as having validity, and also holding that modern discoveries of scientific researchers in the domain of nature are not antagonistic to Judaism. However, that's fine. A lot of Orthodox Jews believe it the same, but then they go on to use terms like the Bible reflecting primitive ideas of its own age. And so they go on to speak about the Bible in very derogatory terms. And then they go on to recognize also a very important thing, which changed among many, and that is that the mission of Judaism is a national life in Palestine, they write, but in the land of Israel. And they say that's off our plan. There is no yearning for a Jewish homeland. We're not a nation that's looking to relocate. We're very happy to be here in America, which, you know, they were just arriving in a country that was accepting them, so they felt like that. But it's also what Reform Jews in back in Germany were saying. Obviously, it's antithetical to traditional Judaism, but this was what they were saying. But basically, another thing that they say, we consider ourselves and this is very relevant even to the debate about Zionism today. We consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine, nor sacrificial worship under the sons of Aaron, nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning the Jewish state. So basically, they're done with Israel, done with the homeland, and we recognize Judaism as a progressive religion, ever striving to be in accord with with reason. Anyhow, the bottom line is they have a religion that they are even against the observance of the ritual laws. They're for the general ethical laws in the spirit of it. And why is it important to know about this? A, it's important to know that this is what they believe. B, 1886, and this is how the spirit of the Spanish Portuguese still resonates with us. 1886, Reverend, because remember the Spanish Portuguese don't have rabbis, Reverend Harry Pereira Mendes, he found something called, to counter the Reform movement, he found something called the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. Isn't that shocking, by the way? Just think about that for a minute. The Orthodox Reverend of Spanish Portuguese founds JTS to counter the assimilation of the Reform movement and to establish orthodoxy. That's one irony, because today JTS is more similar to those Reform movements than it is to orthodoxy in many ways. But then a few years later, the same person goes on to found the Orthodox Union. So he builds these two organizations to strengthen observance. One is JTS and one is the Orthodox Union. So it's funny how those two were founded by the same person. You would never guess, right, that JTS and the OU are founded by the same person, by this Reverend Harry Pereira Mendes, but it's the same person, and it's all to support the Orthodox observance. It's just a fascinating thing, and it's also, again, an amazing way in which Spanish Jewry continues sort of to echo through American Jewish life. As I said, between 1881 and 1914, you have more than 2 million Jews coming to America because of the pogroms and anti-Semitic laws in Russia. So this is huge, huge influx. And let's just say, like always, this happens in every situation, the seniors, the people who've been, don't really like the newcomers, right? So the German Jews really, really don't like these Ostjuden, as they call them, that are arriving. They're not nearly as educated. They're not nearly as westernized. They're coming from all these little shtetls. They're, instead of being, you can imagine if you're a German Jew living in New York, a person, I don't want to say names, but you have these very important German Jewish families who are at the pinnacle of success, and suddenly they see all these porters and schleppers and peddlers and people in the schmata business and people who are, it's just, they don't want to have anything to do with it. Yeah, that causes a lot of social tensions between the Jews of the Upper East Side, who are the German Jews, and the Jews of the Lower East Side, who are all the new arrivals, the people who just came. Interestingly, the Jews are now much bigger, and they start using that size to establish big organizations, mutual aid. There's something called Landsmannschaft, which is a great word. Landsman is a word, I don't know if I'm going to have an easy time translating it, but it basically means we're from the same place. So if Alan and I both moved to Australia with many other Jews, I would call him my Landsman. Why? Because we both come from New York. So Landsman means the person who came from your town. And so Jews in America very much organize around Landsmannschaft. So all the Jews from Vilna moved to Omaha, Nebraska. I'm just giving an example. Many Jews from this town moved to Philadelphia. And it works because those are the people that are going to help you. Who's going to help me in Australia? Alan, right? Because we're Landsmen. We know each other from back in the day, from the little town that our families lived together for generations. So that's how many of the Jewish communities in America organized with these of immigration in the late 1800s. And many of these people arriving, as you know, they work very hard jobs. The irony is that America is the golden Medina, it's the golden country, it's the country of opportunity, but here people are working like slaves in the sweatshops. And so many Jews, whether it's because they're inspired by ideas of socialism or because they're just simply working in these slave conditions on the Lower East Side and working in textiles, they are leaders of the workers' rights movements, unions, workers' rights. I got to give a very big shout out to a woman named Lillian Wald. Very special woman. She dedicated her life to the community. She's the founder of the traveling nurses movement, of the playground movement. People didn't think playgrounds are important, but they are. She goes to the Lower East Side. She opens these care clinics to take care of all the immigrants. And so there's a lot of aid because there's a lot of difficulty. A lot of Jews are working in really terrible conditions. There's the famous story, I think it's 1914, the fire, the Triangle Factory, 1911. Yeah, where many young ladies get stuck in the factory. There's a fire and they can't get out. And so many of the laws that have to do with unions, workers' rights, days off, all these things that improve the conditions of workers are pioneered by Jews who arrived in America. So that's a very important movement. And interestingly, the fact that anyone has off on Saturdays comes from an Orthodox Jew in Massachusetts, who in 1914 started giving off all his workers on Shabbat, on Saturday, because he was an Orthodox Jew. So if any non-Jew is happy with their 2 days off instead of just Sunday off, they have also Jews to thank because it's Jews who started this custom. Jacob Schiff and other Jews start also getting involved with the betterment of Jews around the world, of their condition. And I must say he made some big mistakes. He did some extraordinary things, but because of the desire to help the persecuted Jews of the Tsar's Russia, he starts supporting the communist revolution, which didn't end up working out well. But he does get involved with many things. That's only one thing, but he gets involved with many things to help Jews around the world. And this is where Jews also tell the lobby, the U.S. government, to tell the Tsar, look, if you're going to keep pogroming thousands of Jews, we're not going to do business with you. As Jews continue to come, and as they're a formidable force, you have, unfortunately, the plague of anti-Semitism comes also to America. And here's a very important point. the rise of anti-Semitism in America in the 1930s is extraordinary, really extraordinary. And I want to make a very important point here. Henry Ford was an extraordinary anti-Semite, and then there was a fellow named Father Coughlin. He had a radio show, 60 million listeners, and it was basically the same things that were being said in Nazi Germany. When we speak of the way American Jews responded to the Holocaust, which is a dark chapter in the history of American Jewry, because we didn't do nearly what we were supposed to do, or even when we speak about FDR and how he didn't do enough for the Jews in America in Europe, it's important to understand there was a real valid concern that America would go with Germany rather than with against Germany. So the Jews here were terrified because whatever was happening in Germany could have happened here. And so, of course, not of course, but they didn't protest as loudly as they should have. They didn't advocate as much as they should have for Jews in Europe because they were afraid that that would happen here as well. And that was a real possibility. Same thing about FDR. Terrible, unforgivable crime of his that he didn't give more visas to Jews, that he didn't bomb the crematorium in Auschwitz. But there was a side of America that would have been arming Hitler. So it's a very big difference, and it was not simple that it would, it's not take it, you can't take it for granted that it would have gone the other way. Interestingly, New York was sort of at the center of all this. The address of the German Bund, which is the Association of American Germans. Very good. The address of the German Bund, which represented millions of German Americans who supported the Nazis, was, I think, 125th. I know, but I'm trying to think of the exact address. I believe it's 125th or something, 86th Street, right across the street from KJ. So you can imagine going Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur to services at KJ in 1939, where the headquarters of the Nazis is across the street from you. Yeah.
Well, why would fulfill the amount of these quotas that was allowed? That wasn't even filled during the
Yeah, so good question. First of all, I'm not here to defend him, but in 1924, anti-Semites passed a law against immigration. So basically, all the hundreds of thousands and millions of Jews who came, that all stopped in 1924. There was a huge push, not from FDR's area surrounding, against immigration, and they called it the New Deal. They called it the Jew Deal.
But you
and
had immigration of any kind or just Jews?
Well, the Jews were the largest group. Before 1924, Jews were the majority of immigrants.
But if he had a quota of 100,000, whatever, he didn't even.
But Congress put in several anti-Semitic laws. There was even a speech given on the House floor when, I hate to say this, but when someone offered to pass a law for to allow 10,000 kids, like in England, the kinder transport, 10,000 kids to allow them into America. Someone from Mississippi or something got up and spoke in the House floor, and he said, you have to remember that these children, Jewish children, are going to grow up and be grown. I'm not going to use the word that he used, a derogatory term for Jews, but there was a very strong KKK movement, the German Bund. These were millions of people. Just a quick, very important lesson. There's so much more to talk about. The most effective fight against anti-Semitism in American history was most successful. What was it? So very important to note. So there were all these Nazi rallies starting up. There was a famous one in Madison Square Garden, right here in New York City. And there's a great guy named Judge Nathan Perlman. He was a member of Congress, then he was a judge in New York. And he picked up the phone and he called Mayor Lansky, one of the biggest mafia thugs or whatever. He actually wasn't a thug. He was the accountant of the mafia. And he says, look, I have a favor to ask you. There's these Nazis in New York. Do you mind beating them up? And he said, we can do more than that if you want. And he said, no, because that's going to cause outrage. And so in Mayor Lansky's language, when he spoke to his guys, he said, guys, I think I need you to marinate them, not freeze them. That was the mafia language then. And so these guys basically would go. These were like the Ostjuden from Brooklyn. They were plumbers. They were workers in factories. They would go with baseball bats and what have you not. These were big guys who got into street fights. And every time the Nazis, who were the more posh, more Upper East Side educated folks, would have a meeting, they would walk in and they would crack skulls, break hands, legs. They had no mercy. And slowly New York, also there was nothing in the law against hate speech in those days. So New York started passing anti-Nazi laws. Slowly they moved out of New York City. Famously, they had their meeting in Madison Square Garden, where a Jewish plumber ran up to the podium and pulled out the cable. And basically the Nazis then moved to New Jersey. And then you had what was called the Newark Minutemen. It was basically like Hatzalah, people who are EMTs on call. If there's a Nazi gathering, all these Jews had some way of communicating. And whenever the Nazis had a rally or anything in New Jersey, they would go there and just beat them up and shut it down. Interestingly, this was all instigated by a judge who spoke to Mayor Lansky. And another very interesting fact is it was successful, and the FBI knew about it. And when the war broke out, once you had Pearl Harbor, the FBI called the Jewish, whatever they called it, the Jewish groups. And by the way, B'nai B'rith were also, I think, had a lot of the names. They had names of all of the Nazis in America, not all, but all these active Nazis. And so the FBI used those lists to send them to the Pacific rather than to Europe. So the FBI would refer to the Jewish mafia, basically, to say, who's a Nazi? And when that person was called up to the army, they were sent to the Pacific instead of to Europe because you couldn't trust them. There were also many Nazi spies on the docks who may commit sabotage. And this is another, if anyone saw the Netflix movie about Mayor Lansky, it's also described there. And so basically, Mayor Lansky and his thugs would go to the docks, to the shipping yards, and if they knew of a guy that was a Nazi that was there, they outed him at the least. And in the film version, they also physically hurt them. There's so much more to speak about because American Jewry has a pivotal role in the establishment of the state of Israel, whether it's Golda Meir raising $50 million within a day or so in New York, whether it's Mickey Marcus from New York, going to lead the Haganah forces in paving the way to Jerusalem and breaking the siege on Jerusalem, Soviet Jewry, the philanthropy of American Jewry. There's nothing like it in Jewish history. Whenever there's trouble now in Ukraine, the Joint sends millions upon millions of dollars to help. We have our dark chapter during the Holocaust. American Jews during the Holocaust definitely didn't come close to helping like they should have, and in some cases even caused damage. But in later on, when we're talking about the establishment of the state of Israel, philanthropy, charity, it's second to none. I feel like this lecture deserves a part 2, but unfortunately, we're out of time. Next week, Bezrat Hashem, right here, speaking about Jerusalem and its geopolitics, we'll have Professor Moti Kedar from right here, same Zoom link, everything. And we'll have Moti Kedar from Israel, from Bar Ilan University. And he's a fascinating speaker, so we'll have him here. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you.